Good afternoon, Stephanie. Can you tell me, please, how did you start to work for NATO and how NATO looked like when you started to work for them?
Well, I joined NATO's international staff in September 1989. I used to be a professor for Eastern European and Russian studies at the German Military Academy. For some time, I had specialized in Russian studies, both on the level of my master's and my PhD. So Eastern Europe, Middle Eastern Europe, and in particular Russia, were clearly my areas of expertise that I wanted to bring to NATO. But my first job at NATO was not related to that. I was hired by Lord Robertson, the previous Secretary General of NATO, as a German information officer. That was my entry post, and I spent the subsequent years in primarily back then the NATO Public Diplomacy Division. I moved on or rather on the career ladder a couple of years later, and I was responsible for NATO's communication efforts towards all NATO and partner countries. And in 2006, I was appointed NATO's Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy, which made me then responsible for NATO's overall communication efforts on a global scale. I very much liked this position. I really enjoyed trying to also shape NATO's information and public diplomacy policies and activities during that time. But as these posts are political rotational posts, I had to move on after 6 years, and the back then Danish Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, asked me to create and ultimately lead a NATO strategic policy planning and foresight staff. That was in 2012. So I did exactly that. I created a civil military team, which I think very successfully led all the way till I decided to leave the organization, and that was in February 2020. So altogether, I have seen NATO's evolution from inside, from first of all, jobs on the operational level, and later on the strategic political level. I think I've spent I spent work in support of a bit more than 160 different NATO ministerial meetings. I supported altogether 8 NATO or 9 NATO summits. I've seen all the strategic and transatlantic ups and downs, all the crises, and more importantly, I was from the very early stages involved in NATO's strategic partnership that we built with Russia. I led a number of working groups. I chaired a number of NRC committees. And during that time, I was also responsible for overseeing NATO's offices in both Ukraine and in Moscow. I stop here.
So, and can you tell me, please, what were your views about Ukraine and Russia in the late 1990s? How did you see the NATO cooperation with Ukraine and Russia at that time?
Well, it was very clear for me that the strategic focus of the Allies were primarily on Russia. I mean, yes, it was, I think, for everyone, a very good news that Ukraine, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was very quick in joining NATO's partnership arrangements. It became a PFP member, and it then moved on towards enhancing its relation as a partner with NATO. But strategically, in these years, end of, the 90s, and primarily beginning of the 2000s rather, the key strategic focus for the Allies was Russia for a number of reasons. But I think, I mean, this is not to say that Ukraine was completely neglected, but it certainly didn't play a big role on the day-to-day deliberations of the NATO Council, for instance. There were a number of committees that dealt with Ukraine as a partner, and Ukraine, like any other partner, was very, very quick in receiving invitations to start working on a number of important areas. These areas are basically the same areas we are talking now, more than 20 years later. It was very much about enhancing interoperability of forces. It was very much about defense sector reform. It was very much about building integrity and fighting corruption. It was very much about exchanging views on broader security issues or developments in our neighborhood. And when NATO started to focus on the fight against terrorism following the terrorist activities, or rather attacks in Washington and New York on 9/11, the partnership portfolio, I mean, received even less attention because the House, the allies, the entire apparatus then started to gear its energies and its political attention almost primarily to Afghanistan. And Russia remained an important strategic interlocutor, also with a view to our engagement in Afghanistan. It was, I think, then in the 20s, it was well noted, I mean, that Ukraine, like many other partner countries, started to join the effort in Afghanistan and became a member of ISAF. But the focus, again, the political focus of discussion was not so much about Ukraine's place in Europe, but it was rather like Ukraine is a partner country, like we have many, many other partner countries. And this certainly started to change a bit with domestic developments in Ukraine itself, following the Orange Revolution in 2004, and then moving on to other so-called colored revolutions that we've seen in other former Soviet states, or republics rather, in Georgia, for instance. So yes, people, I think in the mid-20s, I mean, they looked more with interest into Ukraine, trying to figure out how the domestic dynamic would actually unfold. How would this play out? Still, I think Ukraine's place as a member of the broader Euro-Atlantic family was very much appreciated and very positively viewed, but clearly not its NATO membership aspirations.
What have you been discussing during your visits to Ukraine back then?
Well, I mean, you may know, or you know, I'm sure, I mean, that we had two offices, one dealing with information and documentation, the NIDC. The other was an office that primarily dealt with liaising with Ukraine's military and defense institution. These two offices were led through separate parallel chain of commands from the NATO headquarters. So I was responsible for NATO's Information and Documentation Center in Kiev, and another ASG, another Assistant Secretary General responsible for defense policy and planning. He supervised the other office. And that, I thought, was, again, this is just my back then observation, that was not a very smart arrangement, because we had two parallel chains of command and we had two parallel offices operating. I was very much in favor of synchronizing our efforts and merging all this into one effort. But for NATO internal reasons, not for Ukrainian reasons, for NATO internal, unfortunately, this never materialized. But the office I supervised, that was an office that was, and I had several directors, the one director I recall vividly because I always appreciated him as super knowledgeable about your country and Russia, fluent in Ukrainian, fluent in Russia, a Belgian officer called Michel Doré. He led the office for a number of years, and under his leadership, we were actually able to broaden the network of interlocutors in Ukraine. That was, we worked with a number of universities, with a number of institutions, with a number of NGOs, and all these work were basically centered on organizing gatherings, discussions, seminars, small conferences, big conferences, road shows, exhibitions, visits to the headquarters. And the main idea was really to invite Ukrainians to build their own views about NATO, to inform as neutrally as possible about what NATO was all about, how this partnership actually worked, what its objectives were, and to really try to develop, I would say, an enhanced form of cooperation in the sphere of information and knowledge transfer, you would say today. We also worked with a lot of Ukrainian journalists. We invited them regularly to the headquarters. We hosted them for a day, for a week. We sent them to different NATO military command structures. So that was a very vivid program. It was a costly program. It was ultimately paid by the NATO taxpayers, but we all thought it was a worthwhile investment into introducing Ukraine, or rather introducing NATO to Ukrainians.
I know it continues, and I really appreciate the support. So let's come back to Russia, and you mentioned that Russia was more important for NATO regarding the global war on terror, and this NATO-Russia Council, all this broader political dialogue with Russia, and were there any views inside NATO at that time when Lord Robertson was Secretary General and then Jaap de Hoop-Scheffer, that Russia was actually a threat to NATO?
Well, I devoted, I guess, more than 50 pages in my book to that very question. But let me just summarize what I briefly think about it. It was not until Russia's invasion and military intervention, rather, in Georgia, that Russia became more of a, let's say, criticized partner. And he was criticized in particular by those countries who neighbored Russia or had specific historical relations and experiences with Russia. So over the years, I think it was the Baltics, it was the Poles, the Romanians, the Czechs, the Hungarians, a few others, who all cautioned while looking at Russia as a simply wonderful partner and an important partner, and started to put some more critical limelights on it. That was one camp. And then you had another camp of countries, very much led by the United States, by Germany, by France, by Italy, I think supported also partially by some other southern countries like Turkey, who argued that, well, I mean, we don't like very much what we see in Russia. It's pretty clear that Russia is turning more and more into an authoritarian country, and we certainly don't want to support what Putin has done to Georgia while intervening in Georgia and occupying parts of the Georgian territory. But still, the Obama administration back then was of the fierce opinion that it wanted to reset relations with Russia. And the reset policy that started to really take more shape, let's say 2009 and onwards, governed NATO's relation to Russia all the way until 2014. So that is to say, I spoke about blind spots in the eyes of many policymakers. Certainly, in my view, in Germany, in the United States, and in all those countries who prefer to stick to the broader strategic partnership with Russia and prefer to ignore all the negative indications that were absolutely clearly on the table, they really had big blind spots in their eyes. They simply didn't want to see that Russia became a more expansionist, more assertive, more aggressive country in front of our eyes, and not just in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, including in the Middle East. And so when Russia sent its famous green little man towards Crimea, I vividly recall sitting in a number of council meetings during these very special days. And I vividly recall a number of countries, or rather ambassadors, openly questioning that these were actually Russian special forces and that they were actually doing what they did. Everybody could see it, but there was still a reluctance to admit, at least partially, that Russia was in the midst of launching an illegal and military funded invasion, or rather annexation, of parts of Ukrainian territory. And that was, I think, something that then stopped at some point. I mean, after a couple of days, I think everybody had clearly understood that this was really Russia behind it, and Russia was responsible. And so the consensus moved a little bit more on the other side towards looking at Russia really as a threat. But to give you another illustration of that, back then in 2012, I told you I was then responsible for NATO's only strategic foresight staff. And one of the big, let's say, the big emphasis, the big focus that we put on our work agenda was to think through the impossible, to think through what wasn't really that impossible, namely to think through what Russia could do vis-a-vis Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and other countries. So we started to prepare the first scenarios that we put to the NATO Council members. And as I was the leader of this team, I basically had to make sure that the NATO Secretary General was in agreement to table these papers. There was only one paper that made it through, and that was not because Jens Stoltenberg agreed it, but it was because his deputy, Sandy Vershbow, an American, very, very savvy Russian diplomat, chaired that particular meeting, and he took my paper to the ambassadors. That was in spring 2013. And it was the first time ambassadors read in writing that I thought Russia would go full-fledged militarily to invade and ultimately destroy Ukraine. Did it lead to any shift of the official policy? No, it led to discussions, internal discussions. But again, the Brits, the Americans, the French, the Germans, their ambassadors, they all argued that, yes, you know, it is worth continuing this debate about Russia's likely course of action, about its future potential handling of Ukraine, but let's go back to autopilot. Yeah, and I've put all this in my book. I'll just repeat this, but you can still see that and rather hear that I remain still upset about the fact that all the alarm clocks that were rang, they weren't really heard because there was a lack of political willingness to hear them.
Yes, and it's really insightful for me how retrospectively the West has had this blind spot. They knew how could Russia be, and they didn't do regarding that some really straightforward actions, but come back to NATO summits and Washington Summit 1999. It was famous for the start of open door policy, this NATO enlargement, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and why did NATO approve this membership action plan as a universal instrument in the integration into NATO back then, in the 90s?
Why? I mean, because allies back then felt they would need it. I mean, they needed to have, let's say, not a list of criteria. I mean, the membership action plan policy explicitly said, as adopted by heads of states of government, it was not a list of criteria, but they wanted to have some type of guidelines, some type of roadmap that would help both the aspirant country as well as the NATO machinery to really start prepare the ground for ultimate membership. And so if you look at this document, I mean, you see that it describes basically a helping hand. It describes how certain programs would be set up, how certain visits, reciprocal visits would have to be conducted in order to really move forward jointly with the aspirant country to ultimately reach the goal of formally inviting that new aspirant country into the group of allies. That wasn't the case when Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary were admitted. That, yeah, there was some type of preparatory work done, but at that point, we still didn't have that elaborated roadmap, this membership action plan policy. So I think it made a lot of sense to have a skeleton, I mean, a framework in place that would help guide both NATO and the aspirant country. I was at NATO already when the 3 new flags were risen in the coup d'honneur of Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland. I had already my first operational roles and trying to bring in then the next wave of enlargement in 2004 and later on in 2007. And politically speaking, we must not forget that all this was very much driven by, in particular, an administration in Washington, the Clinton administration, people like Maddy Albright, who I, by the way, greatly appreciate, but she was one of the drivers of NATO's enlargement, let's say, push. Yeah? She really genuinely believed into an open door policy. So were others. But I would argue without the United States pushing this open door and really making sure that NATO's vision of helping to create Europe whole, free, and at peace, that was the stated strategic vision back then. Without the United States, I think a number of countries had been probably more reluctant, I mean, to go for these consecutive 3 waves. When we ultimately arrived in Bucharest in 2008, it was very obvious that the French and the German government already weeks prior to the summit in the negotiations of the communique were vehemently against giving membership action plan to both Georgia and Ukraine. It was not decided in Bucharest. I mean, that was something that you could see on an everyday basis during the communique negotiations, that we had at least 2 countries who were absolutely against that. And their prime argument was that we must not provoke Russia. So they basically gave a full-fledged veto over this question to Russia without naming it as such. And then when we went into the meetings in in Bucharest, I recall that George Bush, the US president back then, I mean, he put in his personal and political weight really big time. He gave a long and passionate speech about we must not miss the opportunity to invite Georgia and Ukraine to join to join the membership action plan. But he ultimately failed because Merkel and Sarkozy then basically remained stubborn. They remained only prepared to come up with this wishy-washy type of language that we all know, saying, yes, these two countries will become members one fine day, but then they left out any specifics, any timing, and we know the whole story. And Bush, I think, gave in ultimately because he didn't really want to make it too much of a fuss about this. But the split within the alliance, the different opinions, they were very already vocal all the weeks prior to the summit in Bucharest.
Yes,
Hello?
I remember. I remember
Yeah.
when it was this Bucharest summit. Before that, George Walker Bush has made a visit to Kiev, and I was in my last class at school, and we wrote a composition, a visit of George Walker Bush to Kiev. And that is my main memory, main association with that time. I didn't remember the summit, but at that time I wanted to become a historian. And yes, this Bucharest summit became a strategic mistake for NATO, and we in Ukraine criticized it a lot. And that time NATO opened the policy started for Ukraine and Georgia. Yes, so like we will become NATO members, but we don't know when and how. And why do you think NATO as an organization couldn't do anything with France and Germany? And with Russia, knowing that Russian diplomats grabbed French and German diplomats near columns in that palace in Bucharest and
Yeah, but see, that's not even important because the decision were not made, I mean, by diplomats second or third tier. These decisions were made in the chancellor's office and in the Quai d'Orsay by two people. And if you have two leaders who have already made up their mind, yeah, and who give to their diplomats only a marginal way of maneuver space, any German diplomat, whether an ambassador or the third rank, had his full-fledged instructions, and they followed through. And you could see that they still do this because that's the way diplomacy works in multilateral organizations. At the Vilnius summit, the Germans did the same. Yeah, they instructed the ambassadors, I mean, to stick to certain languages, to not allow other, more forthcoming language being reflected in the communique. And they took this position all the way to the communique, to the very day. Yeah, NATO as an organization, even the NATO Secretary General, I mean, he has no veto power. He cannot overrule, I mean, what an individual and democratically elected leader wishes to do or wishes not to do. So, yeah, I mean, you have certain, let's say, group dynamics within NATO. If you have a larger group of countries who are opposed, who share a different opinion, then they can try to exert influence behind the scenes, out in the open, at the table, in order to make the other, let's say, party change its mind. But if this is not successful, they will, or if they feel it's not successful, they will only do it up to a certain point because they don't want to risk something to happen which NATO feels is absolutely instrumental for itself, namely to keep cohesion, or rather unity, at least to the outside world. Everybody knows, I mean, that NATO is not a unified, cohesive group of countries. Of course, these countries clash with their interests. They have different opinions. Sometimes they really have big differences of opinion. But to the outside world, I mean, they keep on making the same point, that they remain united. And that happened in Bucharest, yeah, so that the larger group of countries, the Baltics, the Poles, the United States, the Canadians and others, they only went up to a certain point to press for membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia. And when realizing that they wouldn't succeed in changing Germany's and France's mind, they let go. And you see a repetition of that exactly now in Vilnius.
Why do you think NATO Vilnius Summit was also a continuation of open door policy of NATO towards Ukraine?
The Vilnius Summit?
Yes, yes.
Well, I mean, you have a lot of rhetoric, a lot of pledges, but if you take away the rhetoric and the pledges, we basically are where we've been in 2008. Yeah, I mean, you have a commitment which says Ukraine's future is in NATO, okay? And then you have a second sentence reading, the allies will only be able to extend an invitation if they agree anonymously and if conditions are met. This is obviously completely vague. I'm sorry to say, this is a no or nil strategic message. Yeah, this is nothing, absolutely nothing. What the allies tried, I mean, to put on top in order to make it look more attractive to Ukrainians and to the world is nice to have. Yes, I mean, you have pledges related to military delivery, financial aid, economic aid. That's all fine and dandy. And not bad, but it's not what I think was absolutely needed and still is needed, namely to introduce a shift of strategy, a shift of strategic paradigm. And you could have only done so if you tell Russia, if you tell Putin, we are going to start negotiations with Ukrainians now, and you have a couple of months less to reconsider. Yeah. But enough is enough. That would have been a very, very compelling strategic message. And we had at least two countries who didn't want to put this message to the fore. These are the United States and Germany. And they have even given us an argument, a reasoning for that, because President Biden believes that if Ukraine would only start negotiations on accessions with NATO, Mr. Putin would declare war at NATO. Yeah. So his national security advisor, Jack Sullivan, has even said so. Yeah. So you hear in my voice that I'm really absolutely discontent with that, because the strategic message coming from Vilnius is not that deters in any way this terror regime in Russia. It's not. It's not. But it would have been an occasion, it would have been an opportunity, this summit, to reverse the strategic dynamic and to really show Putin red lines. And this opportunity is now lost.
Yeah, and about strategic vision. So last year NATO adopted strategic concept as a major summit. And what is the main reason of this of being afraid of Russia by NATO? I mean,
ultimately,
it's only maybe about nuclear weapons, or this, or maybe this continued and stable image of Russia as a part of European security architecture, and this all Russian propaganda, all this brainwashing of the
No,
West.
it's much simpler, it's much more simpler. I mean, you have on top of governments like you have in your country with President Zelensky and others, you have individuals, you have people, really people. I mean, and these people have their views. Their very personal views, their very personal assumptions about how the world takes, how they see an interlocutor, an adversary, etc. pp. President Biden has been the co-author of Obama's reset policy. And even after Ukraine's illegal annexation of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, back then vice president still, Biden said he really, really dislikes, what Russia is doing to Ukrainians, but he will not pick a fight with Russia about Ukraine. Rather, he tries to, what he put then a number of years ago, to impose costs, economic costs, international diplomatic costs. And then he, already in 2015, read his speech that he gave, Biden's speech that he gave at the Munich Security Conferences. He calls Ukrainians and Russians to sit down in order to negotiate what he calls an honorable peace. This is his mindset. Here is somebody who hopes very clearly, that after, some time, perhaps latest after President Putin's re-election in March next year, there may be an opportunity for negotiations. Ukrainians will have been pretty exhausted by then. So yes, negotiations would be a way to eventually halt military hostilities. And will it lead Ukrainians' path into NATO? Not as long as Putinism exists. Is President Biden prepared to accept that? Yes. And then you have, just as another example, you have a Chancellor Scholz, somebody who his entire political life had a very cozy and close relationship with Russia. Somebody in his early and young life visited the former GDR more often than you and I visited Spain. Somebody who, in his worldview, really is deeply, deeply, deeply averse to any type of military, who hasn't even come close to military service in his entire life. Who has a very, very limited understanding what life can be if you need to really defend your country, your family, your daughters, and your son with a gun in your head. This is for him completely, it's not conceivable. And that's why he has been pushing in the past, he is pushing as we speak, and he will continue to push Ukraine for negotiations, because in his worldview, negotiations are the only way to bring this war to an end. And he would, like Biden, be very prepared to accept talking to President Putin as an interlocutor. This is the mindset of people. And NATO's influence on that is very, very, very limited. Ultimately, it doesn't matter at all what Jens Stoltenberg thinks. It matters that we have a US president on an election campaign trail next year, and he will not want to, quote unquote, I quote a friend of mine in Washington, make any type of experiments with Russia in Europe on Ukraine, on the war in Ukraine. So we must not hope for any, all of the sudden shift of policy in Washington, as long as President Biden is there. And that's the last sentence. I'm obviously, like I guess many Ukrainians are, very, very grateful for President Biden's continued support to send military aid packages to Ukraine. That's generous and that's important, and you need this stuff. This is very, very, very important. but he's always sending too little and too late. Yeah. And, and he's not the only one who is sending too little and too late. So the price, in my view, who is paying for that type of reluctant and cautious and anxious policy are the Ukrainians. And President Putin has already said a number of years ago, he doesn't believe that Europeans have the ball to really play hardball, to really push back hard. He believes, that we fall on our knees. Yeah. And so at the end of the day, I think it's a matter of will, of political will, and it's a matter of resilience and resistance on your part.
And also about Germany, we've seen this transformation of German foreign policy from, the support of Nord Stream 2 during Merkel chancellery, and also this Zeitenwende developments, and also it was adopted national security strategy, also China strategy.
Yeah. Paper. Yeah, paper. I would argue if Russia had not attacked Ukraine in February 22, there would not be such a thing as Zeitenwende. There would not be such a thing as a special financial fund for the Bundeswehr. There would be no such a thing as a China strategy. None of these things would have taken place because Chancellor Scholz would have simply continued the foreign policy, the security and defense policy line that he has inherited from his predecessor and has actually co-supported as Merkel's vice chancellor for a number of years. Yeah, so he was very much part of all this. He was very much part of Merkel's decision in 2015 to sign off Nord Stream 2. He was very much aware, and not only aware, he actually took responsibility as vice chancellor for these decisions, that Germany was criticized by not only the United States, but also by many other allies because of its resistance to give up on Nord Stream 2 and simply continue doing close energy businesses across all fronts with Russia. Yeah? He didn't want to listen to it. He gave in, probably a week prior to the start of the war. Between 2015, 16, and 17, Germany was, among other countries, a European country that actually sent weapons, not to you guys, but to Russia. Yeah, under the leadership of the former defense minister de Maizière, we set up an operational combat center paid by German taxpayers and by German defense companies close to Moscow. Yeah, that was not a century ago. That was not 20 years ago. That was just a couple of years ago. And that decision was deliberately taken, by the Merkel government and by Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So all that to say is, you have a German chancellor who is very, very keen to pay lip service to you supporting Ukrainians. And yeah, clearly he loves to do so in public. Yeah, but if you all take this aside and you look at interests, political interests, here is a chancellor who doesn't want to mess with his constituency. And this is a social democratic, pacifist, Russia-friendly constituency in Germany that exists, for the past 60 plus years. This is where he comes from. And this is where he will remain. Yeah.
Ostpolitik, all these developments, yes.
I'm sorry?
Ostpolitik.
Ostpolitik, yes. And if you look at some of the people in his support staff who he has appointed to top positions in the Chancellor's office, who are still on very influential positions in the SPD faction in the Bundestag, these are his buddies. There are those, those people who have accompanied Olaf Scholz's way up for the past 25, 30 years. They share his views. They share his ideology. Yeah? Somebody, like Wolfgang Schmidt, the Chancellor, the Chancellery chief, so to speak, is a classical example. Yeah. And I would repeat my remark: if Russia had not attacked Ukraine in February last year, we would not even talk about an increased defense spending of the Bundeswehr, because nobody would want to take it up as a subject and push it and move ahead with it.
You are
I'm very sorry. I only have 2 more minutes left. And then I really need to go.
And a final question to you as of now. How do you see the future place of Ukraine in European security architecture?
Well, for me, it's absolutely critical that Ukraine gets the security guarantees, the only one it needs and is in search of, which is Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. So because of what I just described to you, the likelihood, that Ukraine will be invited by the United States or Germany or other major powers and NATO is pretty slim. So you, I think, would need to invent a plan B. And I'm not really sure if your government has already started to talk about it. I haven't seen, but I'm sure it has already started to think about it. And a plan B, in order to really secure, militarily secure Ukraine, can only be done alternatively, in my view, through bilateral security agreements. And I'm not talking weapons, and I'm talking boots on the ground. I'm talking countries who would be willing to actually put their soldiers, their military personnel on Ukrainian soil, if need be. Yeah, to really protect the country or help co-protecting it. What I think may be a way out for Ukraine, but again, this is just me thinking out loud, would be an extended nuclear deterrence shield offered by Poland to Ukraine. If the Polish colleagues, if the Polish friends are really serious about deploying nuclear weapons under NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement on Polish soil, which will not take place overnight, obviously, but I understand that the president is really quite after it. That could eventually, at some point, lead into a bilateral agreement by which the Polish side would basically extend their nuclear deterrence shield to Ukraine. You know what I mean? Is this clear what I'm talking about?
Yes. So nuclear sharing from
and it would be
American to Poland.
Yeah. But we are not yet there. This is very, very early stages. But that would be what I would call a strategic game changer. Yeah, and we need a strategic game changer in order to really ultimately deter the Russian regime. Because if we don't successfully deter it, also including with nuclear elements and components, President Putin will simply continue until you are dried out and until political support, financial support dries out here in the West as well.
I know we will win together. Thank you very much.